Hey guys, Molton here and welcome back to this opening video. Today we'll be looking at 6 different useful tips and ideas which you can apply into the main line of the King's Indian defense. It's one of these really tricky and theoretical opening variations which can seem really difficult to get a grasp on, but if you follow through with these tips until the end, it'll make your life a whole lot easier when you're trying to navigate these complicated positions. So like, comment down below any feedback on the video, and I'll catch you after this intro. So we'll jump straight into the main line of the King's Indian, which starts after usually d4, then c4, and black fianchettoing the kingside pieces. White will put 3 pawns in the center, and after the move bishop to e2 and move 6, black will play the move pawn to e5. White will castle, black plays knight c6, pawn to d5, closing up the center. So we get this King's Indian pawn structure in the center. And here we're looking at mainly the moves knight to e1 and knight to d2, and structures where white will follow through with the move, say, bishop e3 and eventually f3. Black will play the move pawn to f5 to attack the pawn chain, and then after the move pawn to f3, black will close things up with the move pawn to f4, bishop to f2, pawn to g5. So this is the type of positions we'll be looking at. And the first game is one which is played between Korchnoi and Kasparov in this position. After the move pawn to a4, knight g6, knight f6, c5. Typically white is looking to attack on the queen side with the pawn break, pawn to c5, and black will try and attack on the king side with the pawn break, h5 and g4. And it becomes a sort of race on both sides on who can get their counterplay in quicker. Here we play the move pawn to h5 since we can't play g4 right away. And after the move pawn to h3, we play the move rook to f7. Pawn to c6 was played in this game. Now Kasparov doesn't want to open lines on the queen side by taking the pawn, which comes back to our first tip, which is to stall the queen side attack as long as you possibly can. So try to block things up if you can. That would be a perfect situation, but if you can't, then just try to slow things down, often with your pawns. And in this position, Kasparov could have played a number of moves, either a6 or what he played in the game, which was the move pawn to a5, which the goal is really to stall white from pushing b4 as much as we possibly can. Since after the move pawn takes here, bishop takes, pawn to b4, black is not intending to take the pawn and give white a pass pawn. We're just going to leave the pawn there. If white captures, then white will get these double pawns, will make it a little bit harder for him to break through. So we come to our second tip now, which is everything to do with this light squared bishop. Now this bishop often seems a bit useless in the King's Indian, but it is actually a very useful piece, especially for sacrificing later on the king side, as we'll see. So the second tip is to keep this bishop and also to reroute this bishop whenever it's misplaced. It always wants to go back to this diagonal usually. So in this position, Kasparov played the move bishop to c8 and brought the bishop back to a more useful square than hitting these pawn chains on b7. The game continued. Takes, bishop to h6, knight to b4, pawn to g4, knight c6, and here black just plays around the knight on c6. It doesn't really care about it, and instead tries to play g4 and open some lines to attack with on the king side. Here we managed to get the open h-file, and that's what Kasparov uses. Plays the move queen to h6 and knight h4. The game continued. King f1, knight takes. Here if g takes, then black will play the move knight takes g4. And after pawn takes, queen h3 is quite fatal here, since king e2, bishop takes g4 would pick up the queen on d1. So in the game what happened was queen f3, but now we see this bishop is unopposed. So after bishop takes f3, queen d3, queen h1 check, and the move pawn to f3, white's king side completely falls apart after captures, bishop captures, and we see the knight never really did anything, nor did the pawns, because black's counterplay was so quick. So this was another example of just keeping your bishop. So in this position here, with the knight attacking the bishop on d7, instead of allowing white to capture it with the knight, black understood that he should move the bishop to e8 and keep it for later on. You can maybe exchange it for the light squared bishop, but you definitely don't want to exchange it for the knight. So now we get into our next position. So here Fischer has managed to close everything down on the queen side with this pawn c5 move, which is a useful idea if you're a King's Indian player, just to stop white from pushing through this c5 break. He's also managed to play the move pawn to g4 and open up the g file, but his piece is a little bit uncoordinated here to really get more pressure going on white's position, because he doesn't have enough pieces to sacrifice an h3, and he's unable to put pressure on e4 or pressure on this rook to dislodge it from this square. So here we introduce a very useful knight maneuver you should remember, and that's the move knight to h8. After knight to h8, we have the move rook to d3, knight f7, bishop f3, and here the knight comes to g5, and this maneuver is really decisive for black in winning this game. After the move queen e2, rook g6 was played, and this threatens knight takes h3. King went to f1, and now black played the move knight takes h3. Pawn takes, bishop takes. Now the king is completely stuck. After king f2, the game finished very quickly after knight g4 check. And now if bishop takes, we have the move bishop takes g4, queen f1, and queen h4. And now white is forced to resign, since after king g1, black will win after bishop e2 or bishop to f3, picking up all white's pieces. Okay, so now we get into tip number 4. So this one, as you know, black wants to play g4, white wants to play c5, but you often don't need the inclusion of this move pawn to h5, and a lot of people will play h5 unnecessarily when really you don't need to. You sometimes can just force through the move pawn to g4 right away, like in this position, in order to just open up some files for your pieces to attack with. Here g4 straight away is fine. In this case, white didn't take the pawn, so white played the move rook to c1. And here, because he didn't take the pawn, we can play another idea in order to break through the position. And this is a useful pawn sacrifice that you should remember, and that's the move pawn to g3. We're forcing white now to capture and open up the g file. We'll also get compensation by using some of the weakened dark squares around white's king, as you'll see. So for example, pawn takes, bishop takes, knight to h5, bishop back, bishop to e7. Now the bishop's looking to go to the g5 square to try to take advantage of these weakened dark squares. Now knight to b1 was played. This was a very tricky move. The idea is to try and bait black into playing bishop to g5, and then white will sacrifice the rook for the bishop on c8. You should often watch out for exchange sacrifices, by the way, where white will give up the rook for our light squared bishop, because it's such an important piece later on that removing it will seriously weaken our attacking chances. Here, because the knight is defending the queen, we're unable to play bishop g5. So we play bishop d7, and the game continued bishop g5. I'll just quickly play through the rest of the game so you can see what happened. After queen g5, rook f8, black played the move pawn to b5 to stop knight c4 and give a retreat square. So white has this entry point on c7, but it's pretty much guarded everywhere else, so white can't really make use of this unless he wants to sacrifice the rook. After knight to b3, knight to g2, rook to c2. Which brings me to my last tip, which is to really target this g2 pawn. So whenever you get this open g file, you get this counterplay going, often this g2 pawn becomes a really key square, as well as this h3 square. But we'll focus on the g2 square in this position, because you can really use your pieces to attack this point. In this position, black does just that with the move bishop to h3, putting a lot of pieces on this square. Now, if white takes the bishop, then the idea is black will sacrifice the queen and then play the move knight takes f3 at the end, leading to checkmate. Therefore, this is not possible. So white went for the move queen to e2 instead. And now black doesn't need any more pieces because he's actually got a winning combination after the move knight takes g2, bishop takes, queen h4, and queen takes g7 now because white had to sacrifice the queen. If he didn't sacrifice the queen, then knight g3 check would be coming. And then white played on for a couple more moves before resigning because black just has way too many pieces here. So if you made it to the end of the video, I will show you actually a couple of more useful games. So this was another really famous game which can be very helpful for you to know. It actually went from a bayonet attack after the move pawn to b4, and black played the move knight to e8, knight to d2, but it sort of transposes back into the knight d2 variation. And after f4, g5, knight c4. This is actually one of the only variations I know where black actually does take the pawn on c5 because there's so much pressure on d6. So we can't often play this move bishop to f8. So the game went pawn takes c5, and then black played this usual h5 advance to g4. But white is very, very quick in this variation with the move pawn to b6, and you really have to know what you're doing. g3. The idea here is that after the move king to h1, it's hard for black to sort of break through after taking on h2. Bishop f8, and white will just defend everything with this bishop to g1 move. Knight h4. So in this game, black introduced a very useful idea, the one where I mentioned where you sack on g2 with a piece and target this square. After the move rook e1, black played knight takes g2, king takes g2, and rook to g7. Notice black doesn't really care about the pawn on e5, he's just really just going for the king. After knight takes e5, pawn takes h2, king h1 was played, but this is already completely lost after the move knight takes e4. A really nice move. The idea that if white captures, then we have promotion followed by mate, and if white doesn't capture and captures the pawn h2, then knight f2 is a nice smothers mate. Another really good game from this same opening position was one played between Hikaru and Gelfand, which reached the same position as the previous game, and then white deviated, I think, with d6. And here we got the same sacrifice. This was a very nice game actually because the queen was hanging in a lot of moves. For example, here black didn't move the queen and instead took the rook, so threatening checkmate with the g2 pawn. And after queen takes, again check, king took, check here, and didn't move the queen again and played the move bishop h3, threatening bishop g2 check. And after the move bishop to f1, black played the move queen to d3. So again, hitting this square on f3, and if bishop takes queen, then we have the move bishop to g2 mate. This was the main idea. The game continued, knight takes e5, and again the queen was hanging. After bishop takes f1, if you take the queen, bishop g2 again is mate. So queen takes, but after queen takes c3, rook c1, queen takes e5, queen captures, and queen e6. Black was a clear piece up and white just decided to resign. So we see this g2 square popping up in a lot of different variations. There's one other useful variation that you should know about if you play like the King's Indian mainline variations, and that's this pawn sacrifice with the move rook c1, which has become very popular in recent years. The idea is that after knight g6, white gets in this pawn break c5 really quickly, and after the move knight takes c5, b4. Now the knight doesn't have any good squares too apart from a6 to move to. So after knight to a6, knight to b5, and here you have two main options. The one I suggest in this position is bishop to d7, and I suggest this variation after knight takes, rook f7, bishop takes a6, pawn takes, queen c2, and you can play, for example, bishop to e8 here to defend the pawn, followed by like h5, and continue with your normal attack with g4 and so on the king side. Maybe sacrifice the pawn again with g3, and you're sort of hanging on here on the queen side because all your pieces are well defending this c6 c7 square, and I think you're okay here. For example, one game continued, queen to e2, king h7, bishop d7, b6, knight takes e5. Actually, black sacrificed the queen in this particular game, and after bishop takes and bishop a6 got a lot of compensation and went on to do quite well. But there was another game here in this position between Wesley So and Grischuk, which is also quite interesting. It leads to a very close structure after b6, knight to d3, rook f7, and I found this variation quite amusing. After h5, bishop f6, we had the move queen to d7. You could also play like queen e8 as well, which is a slight improvement on the game, because in the game after the move queen here, bishop to d8, it turned out quite well for Grischuk because Wesley didn't play this rook a3 move to prevent black from setting up this fortress. But after the move queen b3, black was able to move the piece back to b8, and at first it looks terrible for black, but then you realize white doesn't have any pawn breaks left because he sacrificed the c5 pawn, and then his only way of really breaking through is on the c7 pawn, but black is just guarding that with his life. And black also doesn't have this g4 pawn breakthrough right away, but we still are a pawn up, and we lead to this sort of long-term stalemate, and I find this quite amusing. But I don't think black is worse in the game at all, because there's no way for white to break through, and eventually actually black went on to win because white decided to sacrifice the exchange after black did this knight h8 maneuver to try and force through g4. Yeah, and black's just upped the exchange here. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned some useful ideas to apply in the King's Indian, and I hope you enjoyed the games at the end as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Take care.